This time on Poll Hub, Elliott Morris returns as our guest to talk about new data showing how one super critical voting group is abandoning Donald Trump in droves. He's also here to talk about the shutdown of the legendary website FiveThirtyEight.com. He was in charge when Disney pulled the plug, so we're going to talk to him about that, what he thinks happened, what it means for those looking for accurate polling data, and what he is launching this week, brand new. And if that's not enough, we asked him to stay around for the fun fact, and it is an interesting one. Stick around, we've got lots to get to. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Hunter Petro. I'm Neil Viswanathan.
And I'm Lee Maringoff.
So we have had the guest that we're about to introduce on our show twice, and he has worked at different places both times, and he is now working at a new place. One of our favorite in the polling industry, Elliott Morris joins, formerly of 538 and The Economist. And I gotta say, we've had you on at some really momentous bits in your career, like The Economist when you were doing the forecasting models, and we were talking about that ahead of the elections, and then at 538. And now, starting out on your own. So we are very happy to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thanks for catching me in all three of my major jobs so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you first, and we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to have you on for the whole show here, but you have been writing on your Substack about an issue that I find really interesting personally, which is low-interest voters who are not plugged into politics, and how they kind of move, how and when they decide to vote. And we know in some elections they don't vote. We know in other elections they do. And sometimes it's a little weird how they vote. It doesn't seem to line up with maybe their politics otherwise, if they have any. You wrote about how low interest voters currently, who were fairly on Trump's side in 2024, have really peeled off recently. It shows up in the independent numbers too. Talk to us a little bit about that, where the polling data comes from, and what you think of that.
Yeah, so the recent developments are, I guess, a little surprising because in 2024, I guess what you call low interest, other people call disengaged voters, people who don't pay attention to the news, they don't vote very often. Those people said they supported Donald Trump anywhere between by 7 and 19 points, depending on how little news they were paying attention to. That's according to a Data for Progress poll after the election. And then we know at the start of Trump's term in January, according to Pew, people who didn't vote in November were particularly approving of Trump's presidency, and they have basically fallen off a cliff. There's been a decrease in his support, much more among this group in support for Trump than others. And we know that because YouGov does these surveys, and they will break out Trump's approval rating for us by how much news people watch. So we can see Trump's approval rating among everyone, among people who say they watch news most of the time, some of the time, only now and then, which is kind of nebulous, and hardly at all, which I guess includes not watching any news.
So just for our audience, what proportion, how large a group are we talking about? We know they do define and can determine elections, but how large are they?
In terms of non-voters, you're thinking about 30% of the country, or 30 to 40% of the country is non-voters. And I guess I'll just clarify even further. When I say country, I mean citizen adults. In this case, people who could potentially be voters. So that leaves off some, and it also leaves off all children. We don't know how they feel about Trump. They're typically not included in polls. If you mean the people who don't watch the news, we're talking anywhere between 25% and half the country, depending on how you define this. So some pollsters you use an hourly cutoff, do you get more than an hour of news, 2 hours of news, 5 hours of news or something? In this case, the hardly at all category from YouGov is about a fifth of the public. About a fifth of people aren't getting any news at all, really.
This is all really fascinating because I'm old enough to remember when the Democrats did well in presidential elections because the turnout was higher because the lower engagement voters came into the electorate and they tended to vote Democratic. Now, the Democrats, there's been this inversion, apparently, and Democrats are doing better with high-income, formally educated voters. And then we have this other group, which came in for the presidential. I suspect you don't have the answer for this, but it's a big risk the Trump people took. And is there any sense of how they were able to bring in this group of the electorate to ultimately make the difference? And if they were, how comes the Democrats were asleep at the switch? I mean, that may not be your field, but I'm just wondering what your sense of this is.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer on why Democrats weren't what they did or why they weren't able to win this group, if indeed they were trying something. What I can tell you is my theory is a little bit different. My theory is that there's a group of people who flow in and out of being interested in politics. And they can do that. Either they can be pulled into being interested in politics by like a very charismatic leader. I mean, Donald Trump in 2015 is a pretty strong case for this. Or they can be pushed into the electorate. And regardless of whether or not they're pulled or pushed in, they can also vote for or against the incumbent party. And so my theory would be when those voters are pushed in, it's usually by conditions that make them vote against the incumbent. So in this case, it's inflation probably, or something about the economy during Biden's first term. And then there also is a pulling factor happening with these people too, especially young men, a group I belong to, where Donald Trump is particularly appealing to them in ways that we wouldn't have thought for, people under 30 4 years ago based on their ideology. And the answer there might be something to do with like gender attitudes, but also could just be status threat from like loss of economic mobility, also from those same underlying economic causes. So I would say this actually has less to do, at least in my formulation, with specific partisan messages and more to do with general conditions. And then sort of back to the point of my piece, if that's true, then you would expect the incumbent party, regardless of what their ideology is, to lose support with disengaged or uninformed or detached voters more broadly. It's a theory. I'm not saying that's true for sure,
well,
but that's what I'm looking at.
I value that observation because to me, it's sort of, you always say in a close election which group was determining, and the answer obviously is they all were. But in this case, it really sort of stuck out as an odd. And I appreciate your talking about conditions, because I know in your modeling when you were the economist, that was a big part of how you did that too, as opposed to just partisan messaging, the price of bread, the price of eggs. I mean, those are things that can affect for incumbents and non-incumbents.
Are these generally a group that you see as up for grabs when you talk about them not being particularly partisan and more contextual? Do they become up for grabs, or is it more of a incumbent, non-incumbent? Like, I like the status quo, and perhaps I am not then moved to act, or I dislike the status quo and then am more likely to participate?
That's a good question. I think I just have to say it depends on the person, and we don't have a great sample size to characterize the behavior of these voters. I mean, the way I think about it is there has to be a pretty strong motivation to make habitual non-voters into habitual voters, but there can be much more circumstantial motivations for people who alternate voting in elections, habitual kind of voters, the people in the middle, from turning out. And it could be ideological. Like, I think for younger men in particular, it is more ideological than the average person. By and large, I would say I guess this isn't totally true depending on what media ecosystem you are plugged into, but generally we all inhabit the same reality, and we are generally aware of economic forces.
I don't know about that.
I love
Similar.
the fact that you had to preface this.
We generally have it.
Generally, we know when the economy is doing poorly, and that's not true for everybody. But let's just say broad strokes, when there's a recession, most people know about it, and so I think that's probably a much more driving force in politics than an ideological messaging from particular candidates. With the exception of entitlements and Medicare and what have you. Those are pretty big responsibilities, and they have an economic component to them.
In your new Substack, Strength in Numbers, you've written about a couple of things, and we've just talked about one. Another one you've talked about is the idea that Trump's approval rating is in blue wave territory. I mean, Democrats are like, wow, great. We're really far out from the election. I'm just curious if you buy into what a lot of, I think, pundits say, which is they've seen this decline, this fairly rapid decline over the first 3 months or 4 months of Trump's presidency. If you think that this is looking at polls really way too early, and that in this very volatile environment we live in, polling environment, that this is much ado about nothing.
Yeah, I think it is too early to predict the outcome of the next election, especially by only using one indicator. The point that I try to make looking at these correlations, in this case between between presidential approval ratings and how they do in the next election, in this case it's a first midterm, is just to establish how strong this link is historically and whether or not it even really matters. Because a lot of the criticism I get is basically the one you're making, which is like, hey, these are just polls, right? Or the one you're bringing up. I know you're not making it. These are just polls. Like, what do they matter? The election is this many months away, blah, blah, blah. And one way to sort of, we all know that like public opinion matters, right? Like we live in a democracy. And so us, the professoriate, the professional knowledge workers in politics are like, oh yeah, you should pay attention to this stuff. But a lot of people don't get it. They don't know the argument. They haven't read the literature or whatever. They don't have political science degrees. They don't believe in democracy. I don't care, whatever it is. But they do know that like elections happen, and you can tell these people when approval ratings are low, the incumbent party tends to do worse. And so that's one way of telling them why they should pay attention to the polls. I happen to have a underlying motivation, which is so they can buy my book. But
Also,
That's a good motivation. That's a good motivation.
A similarly named strength in numbers, I might add, if you don't want to make that commercial statement, I did for you. The discussion we're having suggests that the midterm elections, which obviously come before the presidential, we could expect a lower turnout than we've had in presidential. And by implication, I guess the next leap is that the Democrats are thinking, hey, we may be in good shape. We've had all these change elections. Trump isn't popular. Maybe the messaging will change. Maybe the economy will change. But the Democrats, if we're taking what we're saying and crank it one more step, would probably be, all things being equal, be in good shape in the midterms. Things are never equal, but if they were. So what's your take looking at the midterms as opposed to down the road still 3.5 years?
yeah, I mean, as a starting point, our starting heuristic is like, how do presidents typically do? Or how does the party of the president typically do historically? On average, party in power loses about 20 seats in the midterms, and Republicans right now can afford to lose 2. So our starting point is like pretty hard that they're going to lose control of the House. Now, there are some reasons, as you're suggesting, to think that the historical starting point, our prior prediction, to use the forecasting language, might not be super accurate, or we shouldn't be super confident about it. And that's because of stuff like polarization, gerrymandering. Both of these factors decrease the number of seats that are up for grabs. And so we should probably expect the turnover to be less than the historical average. And to give you an example, like in 2022, even when Biden's approval was underwater and inflation was really bad, the Democrats only lost 9 seats. And that turns out to be pretty consequential. But like redistricting in their case probably helped them avoid further seat loss. So, I would put the probability pretty high that they lose the House, and not like 100%. I'm just thinking of this now, but like probably around 85, if I had to guess. That's where the markets would be. Someone can, maybe one of the students can fact check this and put it in the show notes, how correct I am. But that's what I'd say for the House. And then just a brief remark on the Senate. Like, it's pretty tough for Democrats to win back control of the Senate because they have to win 4 seats. They're at 47, but they also need to get the 51st seat to avoid the tie-breaking vote by Vice President Pence. That's pretty tough. They would need to win North Carolina, Maine, Texas, Florida, Alaska, 4 of those, and Ohio potentially, which are like pretty tough seats. They could recruit really good candidates and maybe they could pull it off, but I would put that probability pretty low, probably closer to like 20.
Before we switch over, and we want to talk about your new venture and also the polling industry and business and all that in general, I do have one quick question with regards to the data you've been looking at in these last few months and talking about history. When you're looking at these things and saying, the party in power, the presidential party in power has lost on average 20 seats. Have you seen, as you've looked at these statistics, that the more recent elections, the numbers get smaller and smaller, or the causation gets less and less? And you mentioned it with polarization. I'm just thinking that the new normal is that the old normal doesn't exist anymore, sometimes. What do you think of that?
I think that statement would be an overcorrection, that the new normal is that the old normal doesn't matter. It would be a bit of an overreaction to, what I do see is like a over-reliance on these historical trends, and that the real answer is probably somewhere in the middle, again, to be the sort of weedsy, wibbly-wobbly guy here. Historical patterns that we can observe in the data exist because individuals have tended to make decisions that are well predicted, roughly speaking, similarly based on the same stimulus. And the stimulus in this case is that when a president is elected, they move public opinion in their party's direction. In this case, it would be to the right. And they tend to move policy too far in their direction, too far away from what is sanctioned by public opinion, by the median voter. and there's a backlash. That's called thermostatic politics in the literature, but also there are some additional accountability mechanisms, we might call them, against presidents who have big scandals or run afoul of particularly important rules and norms in the country and who break promises with their party. So that would be your George Bush no new taxes case. And those stimulus, we think, still produce the same reactions among people who are rational and thinking about politics in the ways that they used to, which is to say, not with complete partisan lenses on. But the fact that there are all these people with their partisan lenses on, probably close to 90% of the country, mutes the effects that we see from those same underlying causal factors. I guess that's the way I would say it. So it's not the case that the lower swings now mean something else is going on in the electorate or in voters. It's just that the effect is dampened because there's sort of fewer people reacting to the same stimulus.
So with that kind of polarization and partisanship, is it just about turnout? And how can the Democrats, if at all, turn that around? When you look at the Republicans, you do see a very strong, charismatic leader. And as many people have said, it's a Trump party, not the Republican Party. But for the Democrats, do you see any leadership emerging?
Yeah, I'm not sure they need the same sort of strong, charismatic leadership in order to do well electorally for two reasons. First, because they don't have a reliance on these low turnout voters like Trump does. So they benefit by virtue of being the party of the educated, high income, and wider class. All three of those groups tend to vote more often than the groups on the opposite side of each of those categories. And so in midterm elections, at least they kind of benefit by virtue of being wonky and they don't need your demagogue, basically. But in presidential elections, yeah, I think they do probably need someone a little more charismatic, or someone who is especially speaking to the downtrodden, the disaffected idea, the idea that politics isn't delivering for people is a really powerful message. I don't think it's a coincidence, for example, that Bernie Sanders has had the same message since 2015. He's not an idiot. They're testing that. So he's got the same rigged system message. I think that's particularly powerful.
So let's switch gears. You were leading FiveThirtyEight, the famous website that a lot of people looked at for polling aggregation, for predictions, when it was shut down. Not a happy moment. I think a lot of us in the industry were shocked. To the extent you're comfortable talking about it, what happened? What do you think the outcome of it is on the industry and on how people look at polling?
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying this is all my opinion. This is my experience of what happened between ABC and FiveThirtyEight. I'm not intentionally trying to defame anyone. The thing that I think is a problem, the thing that kind of set FiveThirtyEight up for failure at ABC is just the different business models, and particularly a lack of a business model that was developed for FiveThirtyEight. And that was not the fault of the people at FiveThirtyEight before I got there. So just to crystallize that a little bit, FiveThirtyEight's a digital media brand. Nate Silver built a lot of credibility with people by being transparent, by sharing his methodology, by sort of painstakingly explaining everything that went into his work so that people would trust him, they would trust FiveThirtyEight, and they would come back. They would establish some sort of brand loyalty. And it's also personality driven. Digital media today is very person to person. Mm-hmm. People feel like they have relationships with people that appear on their TV, on their computer, on their smartphone. And they want to consume you, basically, to participate in that relationship. So none of that is how any of the networks behave today. That is not their business model, and those are not their incentives. Their incentives are basically to be quiet unless they really need to say something about the way that work was produced, because they don't need to buy credibility. They already have it in their mind. So they don't want transparency. And so those incentives are different. And then the business models are just different. They make money by selling advertising against TV programming. Digital media, especially writing, makes money selling subscriptions and in partnerships. So it just wasn't a good match, I think.
And the other part of to me was, and I want to make sure I say this correctly, that a lot of the prior data reporting and analyses was in essence shredded, not literally, but this digitally was taken away from us, which seems to me, if you buy what you just said and say, okay, I get that, this part I don't get at all.
Yeah, I don't know why they
Yeah.
did that, but yeah, you can't. The old 538 is, so 538thewords.com, that is archived by Disney in the same program that keeps Grantland, which OG Sportshead will remember, that keeps that website online. So you can still access that stuff. You have to know the exact URL. Someone has to give it to you. It's not, if you just go to 538.com, it'll redirect you to ABC, but actual URLs are still there. What can prompt some discussion, and is quite mysterious and has not been explained, is the taking down of all the interactive content that 538 used to publish, and all of the articles that we published under the 538 vertical on abcnews.com are also impossible to find now unless you have the URL. So like the question is, why would they want that content to be harder to find? What are they afraid of? Or are there some sort of costs associated with keeping that up? Those are all questions people could ask them.
So you do, though, have a new venture, something that you are launching literally as we speak. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I just believe that the power of data is still there, regardless of the business model failing from 538. And a lot of us at 538 believe that as well and want to keep doing the work, especially polling aggregation, less so forecasting. And just like an analysis of politics from a data-driven lens, that was kind of the bread and butter. And those three things are really hard to sustain at big media institutions because they require a lot of heads-down work that isn't necessarily seen. So people don't know how much value to assign to it, like politics internally. And it can be pretty expensive. Like the programming talent can be pretty expensive. So, we think the best way to do that from a business model and also to safeguard our editorial mission, which is to be nonpartisan, but also factual about threats to democracy, about, the way elections are conducted, et cetera, is to be independent. So right now we're publishing this, or I'm publishing this under a Substack called Strength in Numbers, the same name as my book, cognizant branding decision there. And the idea is that hopefully over time, especially before the next midterms, it grows large enough to sustain multiple people and for us to be able to deliver on our public mission of sharing all of our work. That includes code and data to people who want it. And doing the types of journalism that are just kind of vanishing everywhere else.
You're teasing on that Substack right now a launch of something new coming, and that is this. Is there more to it than just the Substack? Are you planning on relaunching the aggregation?
Yeah, so the aggregation is relaunched already as of last week or so. So there's a page you can go to on there and look at our averages of Trump's approval rating and his approval rating on different issues, which we started about a month ago before other people did, and some tracking of the economy. We'll have a generic ballot average up soon for people who pay attention to House elections. They'll know what that is. And that's the normal stuff that I think is good accountability metrics for the party in power, and so is worth aggregating and sharing publicly. And it's stuff people look for also. It's a good, in content world, what we call a top of the funnel, it's a good hook to get people in and to show them what we do in a way that resonates with them. The aspiration is to be quite a bit bigger than this, though. I don't want to just recreate the data stuff we were doing with 538. There's a lot more work we can do. So we have a polling partnership as well coming out. That's going to launch tomorrow. And we'll have a monthly poll at Strength in Numbers conducted with a nonpartisan mixed mode pollster. And we're really excited about that. It'll be the first time that an independent, subscription-funded business is doing regular political polling, and I think that'll unlock a lot of truth-seeking about public opinion. Just do the kind of work that I advocate for in my book.
Now, you mentioned that you were going to steer away from the forecasting.
Well, I wouldn't say
What's
steer
behind?
away, but I just don't want it to be the only thing that people know us for. That was, in my opinion, that's kind of a problem for 538 is it was just known as a forecasting and poll collection business. And look, to the extent that that's what people want, hey, that's what they want. But if we can monetize that part of the business well, then I think we can do a lot of other really important, pro public opinion, pro people work using other tools, other reporters, non-polling aggregation stuff. Let's just put that in a nebulous broad category.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. And what about topics beyond politics?
Yeah, so
that in
it
the
won't be
future?
an only horse race. It'll be mostly political. It'll be branded as a politics poll. But look, the cool thing about running a newsletter is people can email me And one thing we're trying to do is market this as interactive. So subscribers or just readers, anyone, you don't have to pay, can send us topics that they're interested in, and we can try to find places in our polling that makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, like, what's the use in trying to figure out what the public wants if the public doesn't care?
Good point. Hey, before we let you go, would you stick around for our fun fact?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, cool. So let me read you out and then keep you in. So G. Elliott Morris, the Substack is Strength in Numbers. Subscribe so that you are following everything he's doing. New poll coming, it looks like. By the time this airs, it will already be live, so you can go take a look at that. And we really appreciate you coming back, but we're not going to let you go because Lee has a fun fact.
So Lewis Harrison Associates back in 1977. Okay, and I can claim to have been around in those days.
That was the year before the Marist poll was created.
Yes, amazing how long coin flipping can work if you keep at it. So the question they asked was, I'm going to read a number of different occupations. For each one, tell me whether you feel his occupation with very great prestige, considerable prestige, some prestige, or hardly any prestige at all. And then the question they asked of a national adult audience of 1,533 people was one of the items had to do with a politician, or politicians in general as a category. And their response, very great, got 17, considerable 25. You can add those to get to 42. Some 34, hardly any at all 22. Is this in any way to the folks and students have now joined us surprising? And what would happen if we asked that question today?
Well, interestingly, that question was asked shortly after Watergate.
Yes.
And I'm kind of surprised that it balanced the positives so well at that point when clearly we were about to elect a president, or we had just, I should say, elected a president that would never lie to us. So I don't know if that speaks to the fact that people feels that they had turned the page with Jimmy Carter. I'm not so sure those numbers would be so positive today.
Yeah, Elliott, do you think if you asked this question in your new poll, do you think that 42% of people would say very great or considerable prestige, that politicians have that amount of prestige?
Well, look, we can definitely re-ask it. I mean, we can include whatever professions people want.
We can definitely have you back on to tell us what you find.
Yeah, we can definitely ask it. I mean, I would say, like, my prior would be for politicians that they would be assigned less prestige, because that word to people today has a more positive connotation. Maybe if you use the word fame, it would be more stable.
Interesting.
Would be my first guess, and I guess we'll see if I'm right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I know there's also a question that gets asked about whether people want their children to grow up to be president. And that certainly has changed with the generations.
It's decreased?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
considerably.
Oh, yeah.
So Hunter and Neil, do you guys think it's prestigious to be a politician? Hunter, you're gonna probably be the what are you gonna be, Secretary of State? I think.
We'll see. We'll see when the time comes. But I will say when I first started in politics 5-6 years ago, and I was 12 or 13, I would glorify any politician. You know, like, get the chance to meet them. I would take pictures. I would just be starstruck. And then I met a very certain governor who is a current governor, so I'm not going to talk about her name right now. But I met her.
Well, that narrowed it down in a hurry, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
5 people.
I met her, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that there was no glorification of these politicians. And I seem to have really, really pissed her off, actually, is when I asked for a picture. I seemed to really, really upset her. So that sort of got me out of that mindset and really wrote me into the fact that it's not a prestigious thing. It's more everyone's a human, and they all have the same kind of emotions that we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've met one too many, like, sweaty politician in Washington in a cheap suit, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, I think prestige is an interesting word to use because, like it was said earlier, prestige could mean fame or prestige could mean like favorability almost. And I think most people took it probably as favorability, and that's why it's so spread out. So I think it's undeniable that most, at least national politicians, are relatively famous. So I think that it wouldn't be so spread out if people kind of interpreted it like that. So I thought the different ways that people were defining the word were very interesting.
Do you think that politicians have some level of prestige being a politician?
I would say so, yeah. I think whether I agree with them or not, they are in the American social ranks. They are relatively high, and I think that would constitute prestige.
You know, I think politicians have always been people that we also like to make fun of. One of my favorite old movies, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is really, it's ancient, but with Jimmy Stewart. But I always do remember the line with, you know, when they didn't know what to do with someone politically, oh, just send them to Washington and make them a senator.
Well, when we have you back, Elliott, we want to make sure you come back with a high level of prestige for your new venture, and we're looking forward to good things coming from you.
Yeah,
Because you certainly have been doing it in the past, and we'd like to see that. No reason why you can't do it now. So good luck.
Yeah, good luck, and we hope to see lots of good things. And thanks for being with us.
Thanks, guys.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week. Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Hunter Petro, and AJ Gambino.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.